Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we're calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We are now in Children of Adam, and more particularly we are in the poem I Sing the Body Electric, passage 7 and then passage 8 to follow. When I began to plan for this set of talks with Walt, a colleague or two of mine asked me about my doing this project. And one of the places they pointed to was specifically these two small poems within the larger poem, I Sing the Body Electric, and they asked me, are you going to deal with passage 7 and passage 8 of Body Electric, or are you going to kind of bypass that in some way? And this is the way that often I Sing the Body Electric has been in fact taught, where in fact these two sections are often just kind of bypassed because they are very controversial. They were very controversial for Whitman's own day when he published these in 1855, and then of course in further publications. They remain very challenging today. We're going to have to now pick up the question of Whitman as racist. Now, I will let you do a lot of your own research here. It doesn't take much to type into Google, was Whitman a racist? And you're going to hear a whole lot that is said about Whitman, much from his own mouth, much of it not from his poetry, but rather from his notebook. So there is an interesting question. I'm going to lay it for you. Now, hey guys, we're not going to, as I said from the very beginning, we're not going to run from any part of Leaves of Grass. So we're going to embrace the whole thing. But we do probably need to make a distinction between Whitman as person and Whitman as poet. Whitman as person, for example, we know that he set off for New Orleans on the 11th of February, 1848. 12 days later, he arrives in New Orleans there to work on a paper, as we said in previous lectures. He doesn't stay very long. But one thing we know absolutely he saw while he was there was those horrific slave auctioneer markets that were there. Everyone knew they were there. Everyone could see them if they went to certain parts of New Orleans where horrific amounts of slave trading was taking place. Whitman saw it. Whitman was obviously influenced by it, and he would turn to write a section like passage number 7 and passage number 8 to follow. In passage 7, we treat males. In passage 8, we treat females, which is, of course, part of, as I said, passage 5, 6, 7, and 8, and this movement back and forth from male to female. Now, the assumptions here are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down the left-hand side, Talks with Walt, all the way from the very beginning, from inscriptions through starting from Paumanok, through Song of Myself, all 52 sections, to finally Children of Adam. And my hope is that you've been with us through all the way through the previous 6 sections of I Sing the Body Electric. Let's now turn to the poem itself. Let's point out that the poem had a different beginning in 1855. In 1881, by 1881, certain lines would be added. Okay, let's read it. A man's body at auction. For before the war, I often go to the slave market and watch the sale. I helped the auctioneer. The Slaven does not half know his business. Gentlemen, look on this wonder. Whatever the bids of the bidders, they cannot be high enough for it. For it, the globe lay preparing quintillions of years without one animal or plant. For it, the revolving cycles truly and steadily rolled. In this head, the all-baffling brain, in it and below it, the makings of heroes. Examine these limbs, red, black, or white. They are cunning in tendon and nerve. They shall be stripped, that you may see them. Exquisite senses, life-lit eyes, pluck, volition, flakes of breast muscle, plant, backbone, and neck, flesh not flabby, good-sized arms and legs, and wonders within there yet. Within there runs blood, the same old blood, the same red running blood. There swells and jets a heart. There all passions, desires, reachings, aspirations. Do you think they are not there because they're not expressed in parlors and lecture rooms? This is not only one man. This, the father of those who shall be fathers in their turns. In him, the start of populous states and rich republics. Of him, countless immortal lives with countless embodiments and enjoyments. How do you know who shall come from the offspring of his offspring through the centuries? Who might you find you have come from yourself if you could trace back through the centuries? Now we want to point out right away that this poem in 55 did not begin with the opening 3 lines that you have there, but rather with "Gentlemen, look on this wonder." Only in the 55 version it wasn't "look on this wonder," it was "look on this curious creature." And we'll talk about maybe why there would be a change, but let's begin right away. A man's body. Of course, that's not going to shock us because we're in "I Sing the Body Electric." But it's the next 2 words that will be for us, of course, today, quite shocking. At auction. Now what's disturbing, of course, about our study of this poem is that when this poem's published in 1855 and then in the years to follow in subsequent editions, everyone knew exactly what he was talking about. Of course, today we have to often explain to students, no, in American history there was actually a time when men and women were brought onto some kind of a dais or a stage, and they were paraded in front of those who would in fact buy them as their own possessions. That, of course, is a disturbing part of our history. We will not run from it. We will watch, though, how Whitman will do something quite fascinating in this poem to challenge those gentlemen, as he will call them, who will be looking at this potential buy, a man's body at auction. Parentheses, for before the war, I often go to the slave market and watch the sale. This is what this line added in 1881. Of course, as we said, he went to New Orleans in 1848. I help the auctioneer. Now that's an interesting verb, help. We're not exactly sure how we're supposed to read that. Are we supposed to say he's supporting what the auctioneer is doing, or he is defying the auctioneer? We would hope much more the second. I help the auctioneer, the sloven. He will comment on the individual who will be selling other men, does not half know his business. To this degree, we almost think about Christ's utterance from the cross in Luke 23:34, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." In other words, it seems that Whitman is making the argument that this auctioneer really does not know at all what it is that he's doing. He is, to some degree, stupid. Then we will begin with the actual 55 beginning of the poem. "Gentlemen, look on this wonder." Now, as we said, the original line from 55 was "look on this curious creature." It's interesting the language that he uses is if he wants the readers now to look specifically through the eyes of the experience of the actual slave auction. "Gentlemen, look on this wonder." He'll come back to this word wonder later. Whatever the bids of the bidders, they cannot be high enough for it. Now, in the 55 edition, it wasn't it was in fact him. And why Whitman would make these changes, I'm going to leave up to you and your own thinking and study. He will continue it with "for it," as opposed to "for him," which is how he wrote it in 55. "The globe lay preparing quintillions of years." We can't help but think of our Darwin here. "Without one animal or plant, for it," and the original version said him, "the revolving cycles truly and steadily rolled," and he changed the verb to an elided verb of R-O-L-L with the apostrophe D to capture maybe again, as we've said in previous lectures, some of that American vernacular. In other words, what point is he making? Well, the slave that you see in front of you was born of many centuries of evolution. There could be an argument that's being made here by Whitman that, of course, Darwin, the great abolitionist, made, that ultimately evolution itself would just get rid of the whole project of racism and slavery. Notice he continues, "In this head," originally in the 55 it was in that head, "the all-baffling brain." Now we're of course going to mention that Whitman is acutely aware of the great Frederick Douglass. He heard Frederick Douglass speak, and of course we commented many times on the narrative of Frederick Douglass, An American Slave, 1845, such an important text in the history of American thought. Here he'll say, "In his head, in this head, the all-baffling brain, in it and below it, the makings of," and then the 55 said, "the attributes of," but he edits it out and he just simply writes it as "the makings of heroes." So let's go ahead and say it now. You have Whitman, who is now asking us to look at a slave at auction, saying this man, notice he is a man, is a hero and the makings of heroes. Which, of course, for many, I cannot emphasize enough, guys, how in 1855, when Whitman writes this, this is as radical or maybe more radical than any of the sexual stuff that he has already written. Whoa, what are you saying? That slave is a hero? Are you serious with me right now? That is the reason why we can argue that Whitman, through his poetry, is not the racist that often people want to portray him as because of some of the things he might have said in his journals. Notice we'll continue. Examine these limbs, and now he's just literally using the language of the auctioneer. You were allowed to walk up and to look at a naked human being that was being sold as a slave. You could investigate any number of body parts, and we're playing the same game here. But Whitman will do this with an interesting rhetorical twist. Examine these limbs, and then he says red, black, or white, which is interesting, right? In other words, he's assuming all humans and all males and all bodies to that degree. They are cunning. It's an interesting verbiage. In tendon and nerve, they shall be stripped that you may see them. And if you'll think of it, I mean, obviously, this could be just showing nakedness down to the very naked part of the body. But I like this word stripped as it means we're going to show something that has not yet been seen or understood. And then he'll tell what it is that he sees as he's looking at this slave at auction. Exquisite senses, life-lit eyes, pluck, which will take us back to the earlier section, number 6. Pluck, volition, flakes of breast muscle, pliant black backbone and neck, flesh not flabby, good-sized arms and legs, and then he'll use the word wonder again, and wonders within there yet. In other words, potentiality. Within there runs, and then in the 55 version he said his blood. Here it's just now blood. The same old blood added after the 55 are these exclamation points. The same old blood, the same red running blood. We cannot read these lines without thinking, of course, of Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and of course that pivotal moment when Huck has to come to terms with the fact that Jim is a real man, because, of course, they both bleed the same blood, right? There, within that man, swells and jets. I told you that Whitman loves this word jets. A heart, there all passions, desires, reachings, aspirations, joining this passage to back to passage 6 when he was talking about the male that he was celebrating, right? Now, there's a parenthetic that wasn't in the 55, and then there's this interesting question, just like in passage 6. In passage 7, we get some interesting rhetorical questions. Do you think they are not there because they are not expressed in parlors and lecture rooms? Now, this is one of the more inflammatory rhetorical questions that Whitman asks in all of Leaves of Grass. And he takes us back, do you remember it? In passage 6, just in the previous passage, each belongs here or anywhere just as much as the well-off, just as much as you. Each has his or her own place in the procession. Now all of a sudden we're not in a procession, we're in parlors and lecture rooms, and he says, look, just because you don't want to talk about this man as a man doesn't mean that he doesn't exist and that he doesn't have all these things, passions, desires, reachings, aspirations. This is not only one man. This, the father of those who shall be fathers in their turns. In other words, for Whitman, this will be about legacy. Now, of course, we love Langston Hughes's I Too Sing America, and we've given a full lecture on that at learnstrong.net. No question that Hughes will be in response to Whitman in a passage like this, and of course, I Hear America Singing. But notice, this is not only one man. This is the father of those who shall be fathers in their turns. In him, the start of populous states and rich republics. In other words, we're talking about the legacy of America must involve all of us. This is radical language for 1855 when Whitman writes it. Of him, the countless immortal lives, with, notice how he uses the word countless twice, countless embodiments and enjoyments. So he again draws on the Declaration of Independence and that notion of the pursuit of happiness with enjoyments. Then he comes back to two more rhetorical questions. So notice, I sing the body electric. Yes, very radical for its day for much of its sexuality. There's still more to come at passage 9 for sure of that. But it's this accusation or this direct speaking right to a certain audience. Notice earlier it was these gentlemen who are coming to a slave auction, and now he'll ask two of the most radical kinds of questions, and it all comes back to epistemology, what you can know. How do you know who shall come from the offspring of his offspring through the centuries? Wow. Now there's an interesting question. Do you have any idea what this man for sale at auction will someday be a part of? Namely America, of course. And then the second one, set off in parenthetics, although not in parenthetics in the 1855, who might you find you have come from yourself if you could trace back through the centuries? Now, of course, this is a question of origins. And if one believes in the Christian theology of all humans derived from Adam and Eve, then we're all connected in some very interesting ways. And of course, to just finish now, that is the message at 2A, right? We are, in fact, all connected, and therefore all of us as humans, as Americans, are all part of this important procession, will be the term that he used in passage 6. At 2B, I'm going to ask you to consider in your own notes, why the change of pronouns from him to it? And the question of the rhetorical question, who is he asking these questions to? Obviously for Whitman, he wants to reach out and he wants to touch the reader in any number of ways. One of those ways is to say, if you have racist inclinations, I want to challenge those in fundamental ways. Of course, at 3A, we've already mentioned Frederick Douglass, we've mentioned Langston Hughes. There's so many other great writers that we could mention within this tradition. But I'll mention just Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings as one of those precious texts for us, right? And of course, we've spoken any number of times at learnstrong.net about those passages and how valuable they are. Finally, at 3B, I'll ask this question to you because now we're into the middle of it. I feel like when we've hit I Sing the Body Electric, passage 7 and 8. We are into the center of, in large measure, what Walt Whitman was about in Leaves of Grass. But I'll have to ask you this question. How comfortable do you feel with separating Whitman as person from Whitman as poet? I mean, here we're reading Whitman's poetry, and we know, we can sense, we can see that Whitman is very much speaking to us directly and saying racism is inherently flawed and vile evil. Of course, again, we can find some passages in his notebook where Whitman is struggling with the question, especially the slavery question. Okay. Now, from this passage, we'll move on to passage 8, from the male to the female, and much of what we've just said we'll be building upon that. I appreciate you staying with me. Thank you.